Okay. So, hello everybody. Welcome to our first webinar session for September 2020. For those that join us for the first time, this initiative was set up by Luisa Bravo, founder of the Journal of Public Space, and me, Hendrik Tieben from Chinese University of Hong Kong. In today's session, we will discuss tactical urbanism as a crisis response and mobilizer for sustainable change. I am personally very excited about this topic and very interested in it. We also did ourselves tactical urbanism projects in Hong Kong, but I will not talk about this. But I'm very curious to listen to all our fantastic speakers that join us from different parts of the world. It also seems that this topic has attracted a lot of interest of the general public. So we have over 230 registration for the event today. And as you cannot see the other attendees, I just want to mention to you that in our session so far, we have often in the same session in the audience, people from more than 45 countries on 6 continents. Before I pass the word to Luisa to introduce the session and the speakers, I just want to explain how you can get in contact with us. You can send us questions anytime through the session with a Q&A button on Zoom, or you can write us an email. My colleague Ying Chen and Stephanie Cheung will go through the questions and post some for the roundtable discussion. And just an announcement for those that are interested. In November, on the 6th and 7th, we are planning a 2-day symposium to wrap up the entire series. But you can also write us if you think we should continue with something in the next year, be it on the pandemic, maybe hopefully it will be gone at some point, or with other ideas. If you have missed any of our earlier webinars, so we have already 16 such events, you can find those videos on our YouTube channel. So under City Space Architecture and YouTube. So let me now pass the word to Luisa for the introduction of the speakers. See?
Thank you, Hendrik. Thank you for the attendees and the speakers to join us this very interesting and very successful, I would say, according to social media, webinar on tactical urbanism as a crisis response and as mobilizer for systemic change. We have speakers joining from Turkey, Mexico, Italy, India and New Zealand. So we actually will try through this webinar to give a global perspective on this very challenging topic, tactical urbanism, trying to combine bottom-up social interventions with top-down mobility strategies in order to give space to people or reclaim spaces for the community. So we have invited Graeme Hanssen from Yasar University, Antonio Lara-Hernandez from the Institute of Mobility and Urban Territorial Development in Yucatan, Mexico, Rossella Ferorelli from Municipality of Milan, but also practitioner at SMALL, Soft Metropolitan Architecture and Landscape Lab in Italy, Pritika Akhil Kumar from Collab in India, and Boopsie Maran from Places for Good, New Zealand. Unfortunately, Paula Lopez Barba from Imagina Madrid could not join today. And so, unfortunately, yes, we will not have a presentation from Spain today. So let's start the discussion with Graeme Hanssen, who is Australian, but based in Turkey, and he's teaching, as I said, at Yasar University, and he is proudly lifetime cyclist. And he has developed a lot of projects and initiatives related to soft and sustainable mobility. He's also founding member of the University Incubation Center and contributor to the Center for Mediterranean Studies on Sustainability and Urban Resilience. He's a very active, I would say, he's also an activist regarding mobility and public space. So let's start with you, Graeme.
Right, well, thank you, Luisa. I suppose I should start by sharing a screen somewhere. It's always a pleasure to visit these events because there's so much that interests me and so on. Public space is something that belongs to all of us and so on. I have slightly different views on it because, as Luisa pointed out, as one of you pointed out, I'm a lifetime cyclist. This week I'm going to touch on a significant subset of public space, being urban mobility. I've got a tiny problem here, which I just fixed. I'm talking about urban mobility, or specifically sustainable urban mobility. It is my experience, and of others, part of the reason greater public space has not been reclaimed from cars is a lack of clear direction how to successfully transition to a car-free city. That means addressing urban mobility in greater depth. The need for sustainable urban mobility was unheard of 125 years ago, when city streets, alive with people and animals and trees, somehow thriving via an almost organic sustainability if they weren't at war. The cities functioned well enough without cars to develop into the cities that we know today. People were everywhere, as illustrated in the well-recognized painting of the Arc de Triomphe, only to be overtaken by the ubiquitous car and overtaken by pollution. For obvious reasons, the Paris Agreement and the European Union Sustainable Development Goals have pressed for sustainability of cities. If we go back just 100 years to Manhattan and look at the gentleman standing in the middle of the road, once upon a time, people occupied the public space of streets, so that today cars occupy the public space of footpaths. The causal link, air pollution, suddenly became obvious to everyone. It's easy to assume that the lockdown could become a mobiliser for systemic change, but has it been effective? Read the text carefully, as many articles were published drawing attention to sales of bicycles have skyrocketed, including e-bikes. Fearful commuters shunned public transport if they could, and anyone in the bicycle industry have just had the best summer ever. I have a lot of happy friends. Municipal authorities rushed to accommodate commuters opting for soft mobility, with frequently knee-jerk reactions by increasing bicycle lanes. Yes, quick and inexpensive. On the surface of it, claims could be made that we are witnessing tactical urbanism as a driver for systemic change. But from the standpoint of sustainable urban mobility, I'm not so much convinced. There was a predictable pushback and claims of killing trade on high streets, that somehow extra bicycle lanes were unfair on motorists. Is this tactical urbanism leading to a systemic change? With COVID, and clean skies in the rear view mirror, a lot of stakeholders are now making noises about a return to the way it was, pollution or no pollution, so long as the driver is not inconvenient, resulting in anarchy and resentment. Look closely at the image and the claim, roads for residents. Actually, that means roads for cars and pollution only. Well-intentioned as the increase in bicycle lanes may have been, I see more harm than good to the two-wheeled fraternity. In Mike Lydon's definitions of what is tactical urbanism, the point 100% transparent in intent and execution appears to be much lacking in this scenario. In Italy, some of the urban mobility and public space changes have been better received. However, they predate COVID-19. Urban mobility, the act of transporting oneself between home and office, doesn't all have to be fueled by polluting engines. There is something we call human power. It's very sustainable, very environmentally friendly, resilient, and so on. And human power is what has built cities for millennia. The problem is current iterations of human-powered vehicles, generally known as bicycles, may be highly efficient machines, but amongst other limitations, are catastrophically unsafe. With a serious spike in fatal accidents for cyclists since COVID changed our streets, the apparent tactical urbanism bicycle response does not appear to have ameliorated sustainable urban mobility. New bicycle lanes will not solve mobility problems until we start to rethink the very vehicles that we use. Solutions to urban mobility don't have to be binary, just 2 or 4 wheels. Automotive manufacturers, on the other hand, though, seem reluctant to change, preferring to dream that we all enjoy traffic jams and problems with parking. Classic thinking, buy electric vans. But how does that work in European cities? Until we start to recognize the value of human-powered vehicles. You may be surprised what can be carried on the simplest of bicycles. Yes, my television broke down recently. Sustainable urban mobility has not evolved in response to COVID-19. Some of us have been working for years on solutions, even when tactical urbanism drives systemic change in other aspects of public space. If there is going to be systemic change in sustainable urban mobility, there has to be a change about the types of vehicles we use. Solutions have come and gone, failing for a plethora of valid, even good reasons. But genuinely sustainable urban mobility is only just around the corner. It is only by thinking outside the box will we see entirely car-free cities emerging in the very foreseeable future. Then interdisciplinary collaboration will be required to transform public space, to encourage mobility solutions that you haven't even seen yet. That is when tactical urbanism interventions will become more effective for suburban mobility. Now, as 7 minutes are up, I will get off my bike and leave you to enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Graeme, for this very insightful presentation on the future of mobility. As you saw, Graeme was sharing these human power initiative that he has started in his university in Turkey, Yasar University. And I forgot to mention that actually he's the inventor of several different patents held by the university related to new possibilities for mobility, new vehicles that can be developed. So he's really actually proactively promoting systemic change for urban mobility. So now we move to Mexico with Antonio Lara-Hernandez, who is a registered architect and urban designer. He's currently the head of Department of Urban Resilient Research at the Institute of Mobility and Urban Territorial Development in Yucatan, Mexico. And Antonio has developed research in different countries, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Mexico, and Italy. And his research interest is on temporary appropriations in public space. And he recently published a book from Springer related to this topic. So over to you, Antonio.
Grazie mille. Share screen. Let's go. Can you see it now? The screen? Perfect. Okay, many thanks for the invitation, and let's get into the topic. What is temporary appropriation? Well, temporary appropriation is the temporary act in which people use public spaces to carry out individual or collective activities other than the purpose of the space was originally designed for. There could be many examples, but we have came with three main groups of that. In these pictures, we can see some of the examples. For example, in the picture in the left, we can see in Palermo, Italy, a bunch of guys watching a football match. So then the street becomes a cinema for a short period of time. In the next photo in the right, we can see how a woman is cooking in the middle of a street in Mexico City. Thanks to the phone cabins, it becomes a sort of kitchen over there. Or in the next photo in the right, we can see an altar. And I mean, in Mexico is a Catholic country, so you can still see these altars as a way of mark the territory somehow. And in the last photo, we can see in New York how the space has been appropriated as a place of remembrance, as someone who died cycling. I am also a triathlete, so I am very familiar with cycling too. So I work in Yucatan, in Mérida, but we are moving to Campeche. And that is a state in front of the Gulf of Mexico. Just to give you a rough idea about Mexico, Mexico is, in terms of territory, is 7 times bigger than Italy. And in terms of the population, is just the twice. So there is a extended country in that sense. After COVID, we had 12 million of unemployed people between formal and informal jobs. So that is a lot, I just want to give you the context of this. I went to Campeche because my father tested positive for COVID. So I traveled to Mérida, to Campeche to take care of him and my mother. And he is now fine, and he doesn't have any consequences, which I'm pretty happy about it. But I can tell you from firsthand that it is an issue. So Campeche is a state about 900 inhabitants, and the capital city where my parents live, it has almost 200,000. Just to give you a rough idea, this is the city, is a heritage place, is the typical Spanish grid at the city center. It was a walled city, etc. And because of the COVID, the local market was not closed, but the access was restricted. And also many people is afraid still to go to buy groceries and that kind of stuff. Yes, you can buy online, but there are many people, like my parents, that they don't like that kind of stuff. They, because they both know how to cook, they really prefer to go. So I went there just to check this out. And I stayed there around their house. The black dot where my cursor is the house of my parents. And the blue area is the area that I was, well, since I am a triathlete, I needed to train, and you can go and jog outside and cycling. So I choose this area because that area is the one that I could see. Before COVID, there were only 2 street vendors located in these points. Those are the blue dots. Those are the only 2. But after the lockdown, I noticed on the street that these start to appear. So I think is the conjunction is a conjunction of between the lockdown, people were not able to go to buy things, and also a lot of employment. So people start to do something, and temporary appropriation start to emerge. For example, in the picture, I took these photos with my mom. I was driving and she was taking the photos because she was scared to death because of the virus. And on the left hand side, we can see a woman selling oranges. Then in the next one, balloons or things like that. Then on the right photo, we can see people selling eggs and certain food. Then fruits, furniture, even bread. So it's quite peculiar, and I decided to take photographs of all this stuff and also to map them. And I want to show you this. I think it's okay. Those are the points where the street vendors are located. I want to mention that this is not an organization. There is no a syndicate of street vendors. The government authorities haven't intervened on this. They are not doing anything regarding this. And I recognize that all of them, I mean, I want to point out how the city, somehow this socio-ecological landscape is self-regulated somehow. So we can see that there is a pattern, a radius of 200 meters from each of the street vendors. And it's quite peculiar. I always make this point with my team when we are doing research, that it is very interesting when you observe this type of pattern, but that the citizens by themselves, without, I talked with some of them, and none of them have agreed to arrange this pattern within the city. And I think is peculiar and remarkable, this self-organization and regulation. So I just want to highlight that this aspect of self-regulation of the socio-ecological landscape from a totally bottom-up strategy, where this temporary appropriation emerged. And this factor that Graeme already mentioned, that the city is for the citizens and they claim the space. And well, I think we need to look at those kind of phenomena if you want to pursue a human city. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio, for sharing information regarding Mexico and these bottom-up appropriations, which are very interesting, especially now that the public space is available more than before. So those phenomena that you are referring were already taking place before the COVID-19 pandemic, but especially now, we see an interest also from those existing organizations and grassroots initiatives, but now also other people, common people like families with children actually are reclaiming public space for daily activities. So I think this idea of public space is becoming now extremely relevant in everyday life of urban residents, not just for those who also in the past were very active in working on these kind of initiatives, but also for everyone living in cities. It is clear why public space matters. So now we have Rossella Ferorelli, who will present some of the case studies that she has developed at the Municipality of Milan in Italy, since she works as an urban designer managing European Institute of Technology funded projects with public space and active mobility at the Municipality of Milan. Milan, as you know, had already implemented a project called Open Streets before the pandemic. So now I'm very curious to see what's going on and how this program will evolve. Rossella.
Thank you so much, Luisa. I'll try to share my screen. Okay. You see it properly? It's okay? Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for this very gladful invitation. As the time we have together is very tight today, I will try to address just one principal topic by answering a question I have been asked many times in this period of collaboration with the city of Milan. As we probably all know, tactical urbanism is a set of light practices, let's say light, that have started to be categorized since not more than a decade, and this is a very rough literature on this that you could that anyone who's listening can start to read, but that in a general way have been defined as a set of short-term actions which are able to achieve long-term change. Typically this and also with the aim to test some effects on urban context, to criticize or reflect on specific aspect, critical aspect of urban phenomena, but also to react quickly to solve problems that are usually solved in longer times by institution. So it is a typical bottom-up approach, typically used by active citizens and groups to act directly on urban context without necessarily passing through institution, or with a long-term aim to activate permanent institutional change of transformation, acts of transformation, of changes. So to create a convergence that usually starts from a bottom-up approach and can become permanent, but in the future. So my question for today is, can a city within its top-down government structures, typically top-down, learn from these practices, and can it use them without being naive or rather appear demagogic in any way? And so my case studies come from Milan today. Milan is not a city with a strong historical cultural public space, I have to admit. It's rather a city where this culture have been forgotten and erased during the last decades, I would say. And it's actually, it's currently a city where cars and construction and buildings occupy the very, very vast majority of open space, let's say. But in the last 3 to 4 years, several processes have been activated to revert this process and regain, let's say, a good relation with the public space from citizens and from institutions. I say several processes, but the far most important is Piazze Aperte, which translates in open squares, because this is a complex institutional program with that use tactical urbanism, but within a strategical scope. Piazze Aperte is actually ruled by Officina Urbana, which is a group that, an agency internal to the city of Milan, but it works in parallel with the municipality and in collaboration with Bloomberg Associates, NACTO, and Global Design Citizen Initiative. It is not exactly the group where I belong to, but it's a group where my cluster of project is co-creating initiative. I would like to go very quickly about in some images that tell the story of how in these last years Piazza Aperte has been acting on the city. And so you will see some before and after images that I will go quick through, just to portray how this, let's say the Piazza Aperte scope was to change linear typical street type spaces in urban areas into bi-dimensional square-like very flat spaces that can be used by pedestrian and any kind of citizens to be used. This process that, as you can see, is achieved with a very, very light approach of just painting and some very light furniture addition, is also achieved by the voluntary help of citizens that actually paint together with the municipal officers, and so realize the space and can appropriate it and feel a major sense of belonging to that. So these are some of the results. I go quite quick. This is probably one of the best one in my opinion, as the design is also has been pushed slightly more forward with a high quality urban furniture too. In the very first cycle of this program, the results were already quite enthusiastic in terms of new pedestrian areas, new furniture, but also I would have to say in terms of consensus and of happiness in the feedback by the citizens. So a lot of positive feedback has been received by the municipality after this works. Not that no criticality emerged, we can maybe discuss this later, but the very vast majority of people were extremely happy about, after this. But what I would like to concentrate a little bit in the last minutes of my presentation is the second cycle of Piazza Aperte process, which actually tried its best to become a fully, let's say, to achieve a most possibly complete convergence between a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And so this process turned itself into an open call for citizens to propose space to be acted onto. So to propose the priority of transformation in the city. Any citizens could apply to this call, being aware that there is only some kind of intervention that can be made under this financing. So there was a project kit, let's say, in the call. So you can use these materials and do these things. Just choose the areas, make a group and propose a change. Also a first selection of areas where were provided by the municipality. As you see, 52 areas possible, but with the possibility to propose any kind of other space. And what happened is that a lot of citizens participated. 15 extra areas were proposed in the end after just 2 months of this call being open. So I think it was a really successful process. And also what happened is that a lot of citizens propose a very high quality solutions. These are drawings from the groups of citizens that came to the municipality. A very interesting phenomenon is that many groups of activists and free citizens felt the need to ask for the designers to help them achieve a high quality solution freely without any obliged from the municipality. So this is also a plus point for us to be considered. And this is what will happen. Actually, the answer that we gave to the citizen is that any area will in a way or another be realized in the end, but of course in a longer term. So we have some priorities for the most complete project and then others that have been that must be worked a little bit to be realized. Just to finish with the post-COVID reflection, in this time, what we are seeing, what we saw during the pandemic peak that is still active in many parts of the world is this kind of scenes in our cities. And so we had to choose between basically renounce to existing rights or trying to push forward with some curiosity and tried our best to expand our fields of rights. And so just to match what Graeme was telling us in the beginning, what Milan has been doing in this very last months after the pandemic's peak ended is to learn from other cities that are pushing a lot on pop infrastructure on soft mobility. And so in March, the city issued a strategy of adaptation to the COVID situation involving the very quick realization of further 35 new kilometers of cycle lanes before the end of the year. Probably there would be more, but this was, let's say, the first phase. And the program that was called Piazze Aperte, Open Square, has now achieved the new character of Open Streets, Strade Aperte, which is for us the same thing actually. The pedestrianization and an active mobility logic is for us the same, under the same umbrella of thinking. So this is a very important point to stress for me. And so these are some just before and after effects of this new tactical bike lane that are being realized in this very moment in Ondo City. Thank you.
Thank you, Rossella, for pointing out to rights, actually, the idea of reclaiming public space as a fundamental right for urban residents. Exactly. It's extremely important, and this is something that we always try to promote, this very basic concept, also through the Journal of Public Space. So thank you for for actually underlining this very basic but extremely important concept that we are, tirelessly trying to also develop through this initiative. So now we go to India. With another speaker, Pritika Akhil Kumar. She's a practicing architect and urbanist, and she's the founder of the recently established Design and Research Collaborative, CoLab, based in Chennai, India. And Pritika has developed research activities, presented her work in several conferences, and she's very active also in themes related of identity and democracy in public space through participatory spatial explorations. So it's a perfect continuation to Rossella's presentation. Pritika, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Luisa. I'm just going to share my screen. we go. All right. So it's interesting that, Rossella touched upon public space as a fundamental right of urban citizens. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about, but from the perspective of a country which does not have adequate public space in most of its large metropolises. So I belong to one such large metropolis, and that's Chennai. So I'm going to try and present a view of cities across India, try and establish what the state of public space in these cities are, what the state of tactical urbanism is in India, and then kind of look at a sort of post-pandemic response for it. So I'm going to be taking it back to the basics for a little bit, if that's all right with you, and I'll try and be a little quick with it. All right, so I start with the state of public spaces in Indian cities. So, UNESCO's definition of public space is that a public space refers to an area or place that is open and accessible to all peoples regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, age, or socioeconomic level. So now, generally the purpose of a public space is to provide a backdrop for social interactions, to provide a sense of belonging to the residents, for recreation, for mental and physical health and well-being, and for civic participation activities. But increasingly, we see public spaces, especially in the Indian context, in the neoliberal era that we are in right now. We see that public space is more of a mall or a transportation area, like the streets, which have been completely taken over by cars, as Graeme had mentioned before. So that's kind of what I want to address. So the Indian public space, this is what it looks like. It's a lot of chaos, it's a lot of infrastructural elements, it's a lot of cars. And if you see, there are people in between all of those as well, to your left. That is a photograph from a city called Allahabad. Now, this is not even like a large metropolis in the Indian context. It's probably a tier 2 or a tier 3 city, and this is how crowded it is. And there's no sort of dedicated space for pedestrians, cyclists, or any kind of citizen-to-citizen level interaction. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the malls, which are now considered public spaces, but these are not necessarily open to all. They don't provide access to everyone. And the rules of engagement in these spaces are quite well defined. You cannot sort of hold a protest in here, for example. It's more of a consumerist haven that is masquerading as a public space, but that's most of what we get. At the same time, you also see these, a few riverfronts, which are still quite nicely planned, but that's on your left, which is from Patna, I think. Now, these are spaces which are nice for urban residents. So there are tastes of such spaces in maybe tier 2, tier 3 cities, which are not as crowded. But then again, when you look at the image on your right, and that's my home city in Chennai, and this used to be a city of 3 rivers, and now all of them are almost polluted, and you cannot use it for drinking water or for recreation along the. There used to be a very sort of active public life, cultural life along these rivers, because rivers are also considered sacred in Hinduism. But right now, all that has been deteriorated, and it's only the urban poor who live along these rivers. So, like I said, cities in India, especially the big metropolises, are highly, highly cramped. The only exception probably being Delhi, because it's the capital city and it was planned as a capital city by the British. So if you see the amount of public space in Chennai, Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, and Trivandrum, it's quite dismal. It's far below the minimum requirements that have been established by WHO. To give you some context, London has about 32 square meters per capita, while New York has, I think, 20 something, I'm not very sure, but above 20 square meters per person. So in this sort of scenario, how does tactical urbanism in the country work? So tactical urbanism is supposed to be an approach to neighborhood building that uses short-term, low-cost, and scalable interventions and policies to catalyze long-term change. So this is the brief, this is the definition of tactical urbanism. Now, how it works in the Indian scenario is a little bit different, because when it comes to tactical urbanism projects in India, it's mostly focused on street reconfiguration projects, urban mobility projects, which have taken place in a fair few number of cities around the country. But if you look at it, it becomes like a temporary sort of reconfiguration of the space. And once the paint wears off, it's back to the so-called normal. So again, with such measures also, like the image on the left, if you see, even though you're trying to widen the pavement and so on, there are still vehicles that do inevitably come onto the pavement. So these measures, even though they have been attempted, I would say they haven't been very successful so far. Because mostly these are done in collaboration with local municipal bodies and non-profit organizations, and not necessarily the residents themselves, which means that sometimes the residents don't connect enough with it, or there might be multiple reasons for why this happens. There are also a few public space interventions that happen, but these are very sporadic and very few around the country. So during the pandemic, so we looked at the pre-pandemic sort of state of tactical urbanism in the public arena in India. But during the pandemic, what we saw was a lot of social distancing measures and artwork that came up in the urban realm. Now, the focus here was to create awareness through these artworks to encourage people to stay at home. And the second was to make sure that people are maintaining social distancing. So with this in mind, how do we look at the post-pandemic city? So the challenge of COVID in India especially is that there is not enough public space. And even in places like Delhi, where I said that there was sufficient public space, it's not necessarily that all people have access to equal amounts of public space. So in this kind of scenario, people lived in very cramped conditions, especially in informal settlements. And in this case, the risk of catching the virus outdoors is, outdoors is supposed to be lesser, but then there are no outdoors to go to. So in this case, going any kind of outdoor activity is potentially dangerous or intimidating to citizens. So social distancing becomes really difficult for people living in these settlements. And also something that's not spoken about enough is the fact that there is a need to get out. Being locked down all the time it has a negative impact on your physical and mental health. So in this scenario, how do we create sort of public spaces? I've come up with sort of three types of responses that can be done. The first one is the adaptation of existing public space. So the image on your left is from Myanmar, I believe, and it looks at how a socially distanced market is possible. There is a need to kind of reconfigure the spaces that we are used to and how we use those spaces through architectural and urban design interventions. Also, if you know about any of the recent history in India right now, there were quite a few protests going on just before the onset of this outbreak. Now, these protests have been completely taken off the streets because it's no longer safe to do this. And yet, the image on your right shows a socially distanced protest in Tel Aviv, Israel. So we need to kind of adapt these, whatever few public spaces that we have to make sure that people can still engage with each other and with the city they belong to. There's also a need for transition towards active streets. This is something we've seen before the pandemic as well. There were initiatives like car-free Sundays where certain roads by the beach were blocked off to involve the public in various activities over the weekend or on Sundays and such. And at the same time, we see this kind of response around the world in places like Paris, Berlin, Bogota, where this widening of the cycle routes and things have happened. Now, something important that needs to be mentioned here is that most Indian cities do not have dedicated, properly established cycling routes. So, or pedestrian routes, for example. You might be walking along a pavement, one pavement might be non-existent, the next one might be 2 meters wide, and then back to 2 feet with a lot of obstructions. So it's not an ideal environment for any person to be walking or riding a cycle in. So I'm just gonna wind up with my last approach, which is appropriating new areas for public space. So this is a research project that I had been involved in 2017, where I looked at establishing public spaces in abandoned historical buildings. Now I know that there is a need to be outdoors, but there is also this possibility of redefining what a public space could be. If there is enough space, even in an indoor situation, it could be safe. If you could have a socially distanced indoor public space, that is still something we can look at, because there's not a lot of urban space available to us right now. So this is the project. I'm not sure whether you can read everything, but this was done in phases where in the first phase, we looked at raising awareness among people as to why they require public space, or why these buildings should be the right space to accommodate their needs. We looked at how marginalized communities in the area could be benefiting from this kind of public space. So this was the kind of space that I designed. So in this, using interventions like seating, play equipment, crates, temporary gardens, etc., you kind of appropriate this indoor space, which might be abandoned, but since it's a historical building, you wouldn't want to really touch the structure of the building, because that's a completely different, complicated procedure of it. So the idea was to appropriate these different buildings and create like a network of temporary public spaces, which in turn would catalyze an urban transformation of the area which was being studied, so that the area could become more and more suitable and beneficial to its citizens. So those were the three approaches that I came up with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pritika, for pointing out that public space is not just outdoor public space, but it is also indoor. Actually, I think that we should always refer to public facilities that are intended to be publicly owned and open to the public as real public spaces. We also have privately owned public spaces that can be used, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it is important also to refer somehow, and I hope we will have time to discuss later, how to engage the private sector in developing those tactical interventions and making space available, especially now during this COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you for that. And now we move to our last speaker, Boopsie Maran from Auckland, New Zealand. Boopsie is the founder and the director of Places for Good, a collaborative of community advocates, planners, landscape architects, activators, and community-minded team players applying resilience to several projects related to public space, actually. Boopsie's tactical urbanism workplaces have a focus on priority on action-oriented partnerships with schools, artists, and citizen experts. And she has developed several projects at the neighborhood scale, because I'm reading here from your bio, small neighborhood actions and interactions can lead to huge transformations, which I think it's really correct. So over to you, Boopsie, and Kia ora.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. There you go. Okay. Tena koto katoa, ko Boopsie toku ingoa, itipu mai ho ki Los Angeles, e nari ko tamaki makoto toku turanga waiwai inaene. Hello, everyone. My name is Boopsie, and I am from Los Angeles, but New Zealand is where I stand right now. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me, and let's get started. So basically, I'll give you a little background on Places for Good. We're a collaborative consultancy with a focus on community advocacy. So as a catalyst for political will. So similar to what people were talking about, Mike Lydon from the street plans, he says you can't scale what you don't permit. So we work in that with that belief as we are trying to scale up. So I'll just work with a few projects, which is very interesting, speaking after Pritika and about public space. So basically we work with cities already active citizens that Rossella mentioned. So we work with schools as well, and like Luisa said, central government, but these are some of the projects. So here, this is how it all started. We started here on the top right with a liquor store. So our local neighborhood had a liquor store that had been bought in 2006 to be a public square. And in 2015, they engaged the community, my neighborhood. This is about a 5-minute walk from my house, and my children walk by this liquor store every day, especially before they started school. And once I found out that it was meant to be a public square, I got very active. And I was working in the local restaurant, working in the schools, working in the neighborhood, and I'm also a teacher. So I was fascinated by the top down and how many barriers there were to create a space that citizens had paid for in 2006 to its rightful state, which was a public open space. So I started researching, and that's how I got deeply involved in the tactical urbanism process. And so on the left of that is the hopeful after. And so that was the design over 3 years, working with 254 Ponce Viejo Community Group with 5 active neighborhood citizens. We would drop leaflets informing everyone about the process. We created the competition. We created the venues that held 150 people to judge local architecture students on the design. But just before COVID, we were gonna be in March 2020, they were gonna vote to give us the budget that we had spent 3 years working really hard to get the political will to pay for the structure to be shifted from a liquor store to that place you see up there. Well, the 3 years of this process began, I really valued children's opinions. So I went back to get my master's in teaching, and I work in schools now as well. And that's on the left, people familiar with the University of Auckland, is the Faculty of Education. And that took me 1 year to turn that white wall into that mural. And I got in a lot of trouble multiple times. It is still there up. Many students asked me about it because they know that we initiated it. So it was all while I was waiting to see all the barriers I would come across for this local park as a group. So I would test things out knowing that that might be, if we wanted to do a mural at the liquor store, how did it come across and how did we get past that barrier? So in the meantime, I did the first parklet for our group. We activated the corner multiple ways, similar to what you've heard before from other speakers. And there was no seating. So there was nowhere you could sit for about a kilometer for free. So we put one in a parking spot, and the tourists sat there, the elderly sat there, children's played in that parklet. And it was just, that's what tactile urbanism is for, is quickly creating it. That took 2 hours to make, and people sit in it and feel and wonder why there aren't seats where a liquor store is. So that is really, and that was us as citizens and neighborhood citizens. activating the space to garner that political will to make people realize there's a need, similar to what Antonio was speaking about with you just act, you do it, and hopefully they come to the party. So then the next slide is after that experience of hitting all those barriers in multiple ways with government, private entities, government-owned associations, these are questions I learned to ask from my experience with the government because they initiated the process. So it wasn't us saying, hey, we want to make it legal. They said, we actually own this spot. We want to see if the community still want it. And they were shocked at how much everyone was able to empower. And it's almost like we felt like they wanted us to fail because the amount of support they gave from the beginning. But as we got momentum and we dropped all the letter boxes and moved forward, we learned a lot in the process and got pretty far pre-COVID. So how is the city using the existing infrastructure? Is it adapting to consider today's need? Who are the users? What will they be doing in the space? Are we designing with our most vulnerable in mind? How are people coming to the space? How are they walking through it? Which directions do they exit the space? And why are you doing it? And for whom? So have you spent some time, like the person making those calls telling us no, half of them had never stood in the parking lot in front of the liquor store. And they would say, no, you can't do it. No, you can't do it. I said, please just meet for a coffee. And that's another reason you do the activations, because you, A, can get photographs of it looking active, and B, you're trying to lure government agencies in to watch an accordion player or sit in the parklet so they understand better, because they're telling you no without necessarily having stood on that GPS point. And have you formed quality relationships through each adaptation? So we did a couple activations, and soon we now have pre-COVID, all these musicians, artists, activists, volunteers who are ready when they get called to reactivate again. And that took years, but each adaptation and change, we brought them back. So that's how Places for Good formed. It has to be for good, mostly a free place, and sustainable, so for a long time. So we as a collaborative don't take on projects unless those are the two goals, that it's enjoyed for free, so the music is free, the art is free, the food obviously is not, but we as a community don't charge like a letting fee for our space. And so community engagement is followed by purposeful tweaks to place in order to improve the user experience. When we think of private industry, they always talk about user experience. Improvements are made in an incrementally staged process with intention for more sustainable and permanent solutions, and the ability for it to provide a strong sense of place ownership and pride for the humans that encounter the project. So these are all pre-COVID projects. And an example on the top right is one of my favorite community activists. He's our local member, and whenever we change our design, we got new bins on the street that he works on, he comes straight to me and says, I really like this new recycling side. It used to be just trash and now we can recycle. And we have that relationship with the people that are actually using the government paid for entity, and the designers can get that feedback, which is helpful for the next iteration. And so now when we're talking post-COVID, tactical urbanism as a crisis response, as a mobilizer for systematic change. So this is an example of this image drawn by Miriam Moore, who's an urban planner in Auckland. And we had worked together in other projects. And so I started helping a local iwi, and we needed within 24 hours to create an image to help locals understand washing hands, 2-meter distancing, masks, because I think visual gets the point across faster and it's multilingual. So if they didn't speak any English and they only spoke Māori, Te Reo, they knew right away, wash hands, wear masks 2 meters apart. So first, how do we act in crisis? With what purpose? And we organize, we collaborate, and the Māori word whanangatanga means foster belonging. So because we had all the energy from the projects before and those relationships, once COVID hit, we were ready as an organization and as a collaborative to keep on going. And so, for instance, people might have seen Auckland was one of the first places to add those bike lanes or those wider footpaths. And these are pictures taken yesterday. So if you notice that before it was maybe just the yellow poles were on the side, now there's cement. So because we had this Auckland City Master Plan to do this before COVID, we had all the planning, all the designs, everything ready, and we just applied it with a COVID lens. And those lines to keep people distanced were also to keep people left, because we have a lot of immigrants and migrant community in the city center. So it's just that indicator of a line. So these are all these little guides that Tactile Urbanism does at a quick turnaround to guide people. So these are the entrances to our public facilities, to a swimming pool. They added the little arrows to guide people to go through. So these were already ready to roll out. And also because Auckland did 2 lockdowns, I talked to the pool manager, and those are the same supplies they used last time. So in a sustainability standpoint, because some people get worried about all the plastic or all the use you're using in tactical urbanism, all these things get stored and pulled out again or reappropriated. So you're not rebuilding, you're trying to keep it sustainable all the time. So this just similar to other speakers, the before and after. So you can obviously see that this is a pre-COVID activation, but this is the benefits you have when you've been already working in this space, the before and the after. This was a local board funded, community-led street party run with the school together. So they had lots of volunteers, lots of organizations all working together. And so when you look at these pictures here, this just gives you an idea of how you can build your response, you can organize. If you save these relationships, these students will always, they have my private email. If I build furniture, they're keen to sand a pallet again. So you establish that relationship to get people active. And so I think when I'll go back to the last slide. So when we're faced with a crisis, we as practitioners have the capacity and experience to respond accordingly. But when we go back to these ideas and respond in a system that's top down without creating and holding these relationships and keeping them so they trust you again, they come back, and they will do it often for free. 99.9% of the time, all of these activations are done for under $1,000, except for that massive street party when we finally, after all the litter iterations, got the political will. So it's about growing, like Pritika said, you grow it exponentially slowly, but it all depends. Post-COVID, our response is about the political will. And so this, and for me as a practitioner, I can't get the quote perfectly, but it's about, it's a journal that was just released today, but it's about, are you generating positive emotions? Is this iteration? So obviously this is like the 3rd iteration that Auckland Design Office, Auckland Council, Place Creative, an agency that also consults and works with tactical urbanism. It took them a while to iterate that. So they had the planters, and then you have to think of maintenance. Do you have the budget for the maintenance to support those new, but they make you feel good. If it was just a bunch of orange cones, you don't feel good. But when you see that, you have more space to socially distance at the corner. It makes you feel good, and everyone's calmer for it. And so that, I put that quote from that recent journal entry, because that's always how it has to be, for good, and it feels good, and it's sustainable. So it's also, I can't see the time when I do the screen, so I wasn't sure if I used up my 7 minutes, but I'll just close. It's in September, it's a Mahuru Māori Language Challenge month. So for September Māori Language Challenge, my daughter has promised to do a karakia, which is a closing or prayer, opening prayer, but it's just to just close the speakers range and just to help calm it all down during this COVID crisis. And after working with the Māori iwi, we always had this as a closing because it just kind of, you can feel it and it feels good. And so I like, for this month, I thought that Luisa has allowed me to share this with you all, as have I been gifted from the school. Kia tote rangi marie, kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa punamu te maana, kia tere te karo hirohi, I mua I te huarahi. Let peace be with you, let the calm be widespread, let the sea glisten like punamu, and let the shimmering summer forever dance across your path. Thank you very much for sharing your time with me today.
Thanks very much. Sorry for still, even after this kind of beautiful wrapping up, we come still back for maybe another 25 minutes, but maybe we can keep this spirit in our mind. And have still a little bit of time to for discussions, because I think it's quite interesting how it turned out with these different presentations, that we have really the spectrum of those in the group now, of people that really by heart believe in tactical urbanism as a very good way of transforming the city. And also we heard some skepticism as well, right? And I think somehow reality is probably in between, and it needs probably particular steps. And I think I can also, I heard some of those, right? But maybe also for the audience, maybe we can tease them out a little bit more to see, like, how can we make tactical urbanism as a process more successful? Because I remember, Graeme, you were quite critical, right, about the projects that you presented, and of course this is one side of potentially technical urbanism. On the other hand, you didn't really give us also a very clear alternative, maybe like how otherwise, right, particularly in a crisis situation and so on, we move forward. No? So maybe a question to whoever wants to answer, but maybe we can start also with Graeme, like
let me answer. Let me answer.
Yeah.
The point that I was trying to make, and no matter how much I love Luisa, 7 minutes is not a very long time to make a point, as she knows also. But the point that I was particularly trying to make is that we are fixated with certain views about what vehicles should be. And having watched 125 years of automotive industry, I'd hardly call this a screaming success if we look at the way the planet is disappearing and the way we've lost our streets. But the point is, you've got entrenched interests in the automotive sector. They're not, the automotive sector recognizes implicitly the need to change and doesn't. It offers more of the same. And what I'm trying to say is, everything we know about urban mobility may not be right. When I say everything, I mean our approach to urban mobility with 2 wheels or 4 wheels is not the only solution. And we need to recognize the value of human power, not just in terms of urban mobility, but obviously in terms of sustaining the city. I stand by what I said earlier. Cities were built by people. People don't have emotional connections with cities based on the technology or the smart data. They have emotional connections with cities by the way they feel, whether they're overlooking Byron Bay or any other pretty corner of the world. So people are super critical, and people are not particularly well being served. And this is also our fault, because we're not thinking outside the box. We remain stuck in this 2-wheel or 4-wheel solution. Now, okay, a lot of urban mobility that has been put forward won't work. I get that, and I'm guilty of that too. But we still need to challenge the existing paradigms in order to regain the streets. And that was probably the primary thrust of what I was trying to say, Hendrik.
Yeah, I think that indeed you had various points, right? But because you showed one of the projects where basically residents were opposing, right, a use of a street for pedestrian, and I can imagine, I can imagine those things happen, right? I'm aware of those kind of points. Maybe we can give the question to the others, maybe also those that are more on the support of the work with technical urbanism projects. What are the ingredients to avoid the kind of reactions that we have seen with this one project that Graeme was showing? No? So because I believe there are some recipes to avoid this from happening. Anyone?
I want to specifically ask Rossella, watching her work, because she is an urban, like the city's quite large, Milan, and we have a project coming up that's doing low traffic neighborhoods. And that is our biggest fear. When you put in that multimodal barrier, how is Milan, because I've seen you've done a few already, how is that taken by, what are your tactics for that? Each iteration as you take cars away from a place and give it back to either most likely just slow the traffic. You're not necessarily, you may be taking away parking spaces, but you're slowing the traffic for everyone to move around safer. So yeah, I was specifically asking about that, really.
Yeah, actually let's say the most diffused tool to achieve this instrument is the legal instrument of the institution of Zone 30, which is 30 zones, where cars can move only for a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour. Also, it also exists 20 zones and 10 zones, which are less diffused in Italy. At the moment, in the majority of this intervention, what happens on the border of the new pedestrian areas is that basically new 30 areas are instituted, which means new signal, a very, let's say, iterative work of construction of the border with specific design pieces that are removable and low-cost plastic pieces, but also have to very clearly portray that the transformation is happening and what cars have to do in the new set of rules. This is a very difficult task, actually, not always working in the first phase. You need a lot of work to do and redo this very small adjustment and changes, and also work a lot with the citizens, even when the work is under process, let's say. When these interventions have been realized, we had a lot of in itinere, which means in progress feedbacks from groups of citizens spontaneously and also under request asked to comment the results, the effectiveness of the transformation that were being realized. And what happened is that several times the comments of citizens actually helped us adjust small errors or unpredicted collateral effects of the transformation, like, for example, I don't know, sensorial or perceptive effects that were not foreseeable, let's say, for example, visual, yes.
But I guess my question really is in the iteration. So even if we were to ask how local government get involved, the more specifics of it. So you can say that you had these iterations, but what specifically was an angry driver saying? Because we saw a picture that Graeme gave us, and we heard that you said there were, I would love to know like a specific thing that a driver was angry about and how you crossed that barrier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, at times, let's say the dimension of curbs or curves have not been designed at perfection on the first attempt and then have been adjusted several times, or the safety of the visibility of some pedestrian crossing were in some first attempts not perfect. So when we were thinking about achieving a stronger security for pedestrian, in reality we were creating new dangers for that specific crossing, because maybe the signal were not so obviously comprehensible for drivers, and so where we thought the pedestrian was already safe, in reality it was not, and so we were exposing pedestrians to new dangers that were unpredicted before. So a lot of rework has been done on every one of these single works, but I think this is the very value of tactical urbanism, so that you can change and adapt and solve problems, while in traditional intervention you have a one-shot possibility, and then it's quite tough to correct problems when they emerge. And so as all these practices are quite experimental, and of course the consensus is not 100% every time. Sometimes we have also angry people that we have to work with.
Before going to the questions of the audience, I just want to add on one thing to this, and maybe, I don't know if later even Rossella can come back to it, but also we should open to the other people as well. But you were mentioning that there is this involvement also of some link to Bloomberg. And of course, one thing I just want to add from our own experience when we went to New York to study, studied in different places, those kind of government programs that would allow for citizens to propose something, right? And then on the other hand, help implement it, right? Because I think those kind of constellations are kind of quite interesting. And we felt that given that Bloomberg also has brought us Hudson Yards, which is maybe one of the most exclusive places in the world. But the public plaza program that he initiated in New York with a combination of basically, which is implemented by the transport department, but proposed by local residents and communities, seem to be a kind of very interesting constellation, because you can answer to those kind of questions that Boopsie had about like all the kind of traffic problems. And also if you have a high dense city, where do you take the space, right? So often you have to use some kind of street spaces, right? And then on the other hand, but still leave basically the community to propose. So that seemed to be kind of interesting. And it's also kind of interesting how some of those ideas seem to, I don't know exactly how it works in Milan, but at least there's some kind of connection into this kind of bottom up and top down. Okay, so I want to give the word to Ingven because Pritika, maybe you have directly a comment on this. Yeah, maybe you can do this. And then afterwards we have Ingven raising some questions from the audience. Okay, Pritika?
Yeah, just taking off from Rossella's point of, managing sort of user feedback throughout the process. I think there's also a need to have designers with local knowledge, with situated knowledge of the areas. Many times we see, like for example, I was involved in a project with a firm before I started Collab, where I worked on a project in Coimbatore, which is one of the images that I showed before. Where we were looking at how to sort of widen the footpaths in the area and make it more usable for residents. Now, as we were doing this project, we had interesting feedback from people who worked in the area, and they actually, one old woman actually came up to me and said, "Why are you doing all this for the city? These people don't respect these things." So there is a need to involve citizens in the design, in a process of co-creation, rather than just me going from my city to another city and proposing something there. Yes, there is some usefulness of a designer's knowledge, but I think it cannot surpass that coming from local citizens who live in the area. So in terms of ingredients, I would say involvement of local residents and also local knowledge of the designer itself can be a huge bonus.
Yeah, I totally agree. Ingven, do you have, I think there are a whole couple of questions that came from the audience, right?
Yes.
Want to share one with us?
Yeah, I think we can answer two of the questions, because it's all about the role of the government in this kind of the tactical urbanism. The first one is like a quick one, asking especially to the Rossella, because it seems like you mentioned about lots of the fundings from the municipal government. So this question, just wondering about, do you get any funding from other alternative resource or only from the government? And also the other question is from the audiences whose name is Kelly Agopia. And the question is she posted as, it seems like the tactical urbanism is more effective when it's promoted bottom up with intense community participation. But what should be the role of the local government? Also, as we know, during the COVID is quite needed, has this kind of intervention of the government's power. And does the change of a local administration with election or something else can impact this tactical urbanism initiatives? Yeah. So I think any of you can just jump in and based on your, because it seems like today you all share about like what this kind of a design tactic used to be, and something changed after the COVID pandemic. And so how's the government's role in this kind of activities? Yeah.
Yeah, if you want, I can answer the first question that was more direct to me and open the second for everyone. For what concerns fundings, yes, actually, as I mentioned, actually in the city, several different initiatives in tactical urbanism actions are on. This is only the biggest one, let's say, and the most strategical one, as it has a general scope regarding all the cities, peripheries, and so on. This specific initiative is mostly funded by the city itself. But for example, I can just give you my personal experience as I am working with the European Institution of Technology, EIT, which is co-founding some of these initiatives under specific calls that are devoted to active mobility, but also for the COVID emergency itself, and a lot of parallel projects that I cannot mention for a matter of time are currently active in the city of Milan, funded, for example, for this European institution.
So for local board, so my smaller projects were about $1,000 from the local board, but those were all grants I had to write. So I had to have community say, I'd come and play an instrument. So as a practitioner in the very beginning, I never paid myself. I literally just paid the musician and the weaver and each person that was providing an art. When I realized though that in other cities that wasn't the case, they had not-for-profits doing that collaborative role that were funded. So an interesting thing with Antonio, I follow a lot of groups that are the not-for-profits, and they, in LA, they had a GoFundMe for all their trolley people to get money because they were undocumented, so they didn't have money. They didn't apply for the subsidy. So it's all those not-for-profits that are missing, as far as I can tell, in New Zealand, that work with the local government, and they go directly to the not-for-profit, and the not-for-profit holds all those relationships. So you have to trust that the not-for-profit are giving the money to those community people and also activating the spaces, knowing that the community have that in mind. And so I went to America to see ones that were existing. So San Antonio, Texas, their cultures program are in the same office. So the not-for-profit is in the same office as the government agency, and they all trust each other. They're all transparent. And that seemed to me like a desirable way to operate public space, because it was shared, but it was full of trust, and it didn't seem corrupt at all. But I just thought that was a nice way to operate. So you have the local government, the not-for-profit, sharing all the time, and the relationship of the citizens goes directly to the not-for-profit at a regular basis. Because I find in this role, you're either on LinkedIn for the government agencies, but you're on Facebook and Instagram for the people. So it's just to give you an idea of how many things you're following. But the local board have a huge role to play, and that's usually the funding.
I think your point is quite interesting, because what we discovered when we studied those places in New York, they were created with a plaza program, and where was this kind of very strong community engagement with the government together, but very much by the community, that under COVID, because some of those places were, you can go back, like some of our videos that we had at the very beginning on Corona Plaza and so on, where really the epicenter of the outbreak was, that so really problematic situation under COVID, and where the only people that really could help were basically those people that were already brought together before, as you were saying also from the case in Auckland or in New Zealand, right? And then basically brought people over the crisis. And that's also what we see here in Hong Kong. Was there still like another feedback to that question, maybe from Mexico or from somewhere else? If not, maybe we can still have one more question from Ingfen, and then Luisa had also something. Anything, Antonio or anyone wanted to also answer to this?
I would like to bring something into the table. It's more a sort of a philosophical question. And I ask this to myself because I have been a practitioner, a researcher, and now I am working with the government. Although my presentation had nothing to do as government interventions. I am always wondering if I can appreciate how people or citizens or the city organize by themselves without me as doing an intervention. I mean, without a deterministic idea of how design could change or improve something. So I am just bringing this into the table because I think it's important that to have the idea that design can solve things to a certain extent, and we also have cultural factors. And that change, it really can change how people use spaces. And sometimes, for example, I'm pretty sure that I lived in Auckland, I don't know, 6 years ago. Maybe Auckland now is not the same Auckland when I left. So people change, places change, and certainly I think COVID will change all of us. I just wanted to bring this into discussion to ambition.
So this is basically about the role of the designer in the process, which I think, I think Rossella had something interesting, of course, no, because in that case, there was a lot of involvement, community and the designers together, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting anecdotes that I could think to, and one could probably better answer to Pritika's question or note before, and that is the fact that, for example, as you saw, many of these interventions rely on a set of only 3 colors that are white, yellow, and blue, but that's just because they're the typical street colors that we reuse to realize the same intervention that are already owned by the cities, and so it's the same material. No? What happened in one of these cases when we intervened into a neighborhood where quite a historical identity was present, was that even if the project was carefully explained to be temporary, and so to have a, let's say, pop character, and that can last, let's say, 1 or 2 years as a maximum, and then has to be changed, has to be remade. What we got in return was a quite aggressive reaction from the neighborhood, because they didn't accept those colors, because those colors did not represent the identity of the neighborhood. That was really a historical neighborhood based on stones, where the dominant colors were these brown and reddish colors of stones and so on. And we learned in a very quick way that a technical approach that only was aimed at solving a budget problem, so let's use what we got actually, then could trigger a cultural problem. And in the following attempt, we are trying to achieve new colors and to let people enter more directly in the choices, even in these language problems, let's say. And also, of course, as you saw, the answers from the citizens, even those that were helped by some designers, were very various in character and in as imaginaries, let's say. So anyone was able to imagine a different neighborhood more close to their sense of place. For what concerns the presence of designers, I totally agree with Antonio. Designers, let's say, it's always better to under-design a place than to over-design it, because you can always add something more, but cut errors of over-design is usually very difficult.
Pritika? Yeah.
I mean, generally, there's this conventional notion that designers are the decision makers, or, you know, we kind of become a part of the top-down setup that is already there. where we kind of become the decision makers and impose our decisions, sometimes inadvertently, yes. But I mean, that should not really be the role of designers, in my opinion. Designers are meant to be facilitators and managers of people's expectations versus the requirements of other stakeholders, including local governments and, you know, say from contractors, from suppliers, vendors, whatever it is. The designer's role is to be a facilitator between the various agencies involved. So many of these projects which start as bottom-up projects through residents themselves, they often do contact designers to help them out in some cases. Those cases are typically more successful in some ways because there is something that is born out of that collaboration which enriches the project a lot more. I'm not saying that residents can't do projects themselves. Of course they can. They are most successful. I mean, they are very successful in scenarios where they have the most knowledge, but a designer should be able to go into a scenario where he or she may not have the required knowledge and should be prepared to acquire that from local players. So that is somewhere I feel that architects, urbanists, designers, whatever term you want to call them, that's where we all kind of lack a little bit.
Ingfen, do you want to put forward this question of Sujata, maybe?
Yes. Sujata was asking, especially for Rossella, but maybe other speakers you can still answer. The question is, have any traffic impact assessments done before the tactical urbanism interventions? Because it seems to be a big issue to be addressed in many cities.
Yes, this is a big issue actually. We are trying several attempts to measure impacts. This has been done so far in a quite, let's say, analogic way. So the group observed carefully the area before and during the works and after the works, and tried to measure the impact in terms of new people staying in the area more than before, the length of use. Let's say the period of stay inside a place where new benches are, where there wasn't before, and so on. And we are also in this new post-COVID phase trying to use more automatic ways to measure this, as by putting sensors, for example, in through all along the new bike lanes to measure local use in terms of number of uses during the day and the night, and trying to assess in a way an impact on the percentage, the pollution, the air pollution actually. But this, as this is, let's say, an initial work, we still have partial data. We have a lot of data, but it has to be worked a little bit, particularly the one regarding pollutions, because these interventions have been realized on very wide streets that are highly polluted in Milan. So of course the impact of this transformation have to be measured on a long time, not just on the fact that you have some more cyclists using the new pop-up bike lane, but in the fact that car drivers in a way in the long term choose in the end not to use their cars anymore, because the streets are now narrower than before, and are allowing more space for other uses rather than car ones. So I think it's mid to long-term effort that we will see for this.
Maybe Graeme, do you want to jump in again to see, like, is there anything from your mobility side that you want to add to that? You're muted. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. I have to say that data gathering is an essential part of urban living labs anyway. We need to know what's going on. But the problem is, Rossella or Hendrik, we don't have pre-existing data. We don't really know the volumes that happened prior to that. And beyond that, we don't have a lot of data about cyclists. We don't have a lot of valid data about the automobile drivers either. So it's difficult to understand what the set-off is. The only thing that we can imagine, Hendrik, is that once we start interventions, we ensure that data gathering is an absolutely essential aspect of this from the get-go, so that we can observe trends over a period of time. Now, I can say, for example, in the past 6 months, despite the lockdowns, I've actually cycled more kilometers than I've done for quite some time, because the bicycle paths and streets were clear and I was less likely to get killed. And a cyclist is not a cyclist. A serious cyclist is not a cyclist unless they've been knocked off their bicycle several times. Right, Antonio? But the point...
Totally right. Totally agree.
I have scars to prove it. But what I can only say from observation is that I cycled a lot more because of a lack of vehicles. Okay, sometimes I wasn't really allowed to cycle, but then I knew where to go where nobody would be observing me. And the thing that I suppose stressed me most about bicycle paths during the past 6 months is that bicycle paths seem to be for everybody, despite the fact that bicycle paths are clearly demarked with very visible signs. Every person thinks they have the right to either carry out sport or just walk along it because it's more smooth. And so the surface is more smooth. And if you really want to know about abuse, forget about drivers, try telling somebody walking down a bicycle path that this is not for walking. But bottom line, Rossella or Hendrik, we need more data. We need to recognize that we need to start gathering it very early in the piece.
Well, I think like we have a project. We have a project in Hong Kong, a walk DVSC that's going on since 2001 to try to pedestrianize, or at least have a little bit more of pedestrian quality and maybe also biking, or at least actually just for walking a little bit more space. And we have gathered like 20 years of data, and it's never happening, right? There was one kind of a little bit tactical urbanism event for a short time, but basically there's an entire resistance to any change, right? Even like small change. So maybe, because I think time's almost up, or actually we are already over our usual time, is there any kind of last feedback from the round of great speakers that we have? Because one reason why we came back to this topic of tactical urbanism, because we know it was a fashion, it went a little bit out of fashion, but it came back under the pandemic as something, oh, now finally, maybe we can make a move forward in a kind of fast way. But then it's a question like, how do we do it? And then of course, all the questions that we saw that rightly maybe so Graeme brought up. So if we now move forward, is there a kind of certain kind of quality in this kind of approach or not? Any kind of just one sentence before we head out?
I could start.
Yeah.
Basically, if I think in one sentence, if you look at it with the lens that is in New Zealand, a Maori lens, a Pacifica lens, a migrant lens, and then you look at it for children and vulnerable people, and at the end of that all, you look at it, is it sustainable? And is it a path to permanence? So if you're using tactical urbanism, you're not doing it for a one-off, it's fun. It has all those lenses on it, and then you go for, that's your beginning. And that's how I like to start projects. You can take with that what you will, but I think I try to apply like a glasses and swap the lens out each time, and then I start. Thank you.
Hendrik, I really need to pick up on what Boopsie has just said there, because that I didn't pick up on this earlier. The big deal about sustainable urban mobility is that it has the opportunity to bring greater diversity in connectivity for so many different users. If we start thinking beyond the binary solutions that I keep referring to, you've got the opportunity to get older and younger and more diverse people involved in the fabric of sustainable urban mobility. Now I'll stop.
Okay.
I might add. I know that Graeme mentioned earlier on that we have very fixed notions, binary notions of urban mobility. I think that's pretty true of our notions of the city, of public space as well. We have very fixed ideas of what is public space and what is not. So even in this post-pandemic era that India is actually transitioning towards, because we're just about opening up, all these tactical urbanism measures that were put in place are already being ignored. People are crowding in areas simply because there is nowhere else to go. Nobody would want to stand that close to each other when it's dangerous. But that is the kind of position we find ourselves in. So maybe there is a need to reimagine what a public space in such densities could be, and if there could be any tactical urbanism measures to appropriate or create new spaces for people. I think that's the focus for at least an Indian context.
Rossella, Antonio, any last sentence? No?
No, it's just, I think pretty much anything is already has been said. I would only add that really what the pandemics told us is I don't really believe in the narrative of opportunity. I rather believe in the narrative of advice. Let's say I would take this rather as the final advice for things to be done. So we cannot pretend not to listen to the messages nature is giving us, and to act quickly. One of the possible ways is tactical urbanism. It's quick, which is already a value in my opinion.
What I mean, in my case, I just want to add the point. In my office, we are more than 60 people. Do you know how many of us go there cycling? 3, just 3.
So many?
Just 3. And it's challenging, yes, but I think that we are going there step by step. I have also started with my own father. When I said to him, let's go to the supermarket, and he said, but let's go in the car. And I said, no, please, Dad, it's just 400 meters from here. We can walk, so I think it's challenging, yes, but I think we are in the right side of this scenario. And I just want to close with that. I think if we give the example, we can, make this happen.
Sorry, I have one last point.
Yeah.
I feel like we constantly get stuck in this narrative of top down and bottom up. And when it comes to tactical urbanism, especially, there needs to be more of a synergy between all stakeholders involved. So that's the absolute last, I promise.
Okay. Thank you very much for this amazing panel from all different parts of the world, and a lot of new insights and through your sharing and valid points. Luisa, do you want to just close the session?
Yes. Sorry, you want to say something more?
No, I just didn't see you, and I thought you were gone.
No, I'm here. I'm listening actually to this very interesting roundtable discussion, and I'm also reading here the comments and questions that we are receiving in the Q&A, and I would like to actually read one of the comments coming from Martin Brennan from Melbourne in Australia. He says, tactical urbanism requires tactical governance. Because I think, I mean, even with all our energy coming from bottom up, we still need consensus with the city officials and city authorities. And so that's why I think it is very important that we actually develop this co-design process that is leading to practical solutions. The engagement of local governments is key in systemic change, I think, not just in practical solutions that we will later see implemented in public space, but also in changing the mindset of designers for future generations and for a more human and sustainable environment in cities. So thank you everyone for joining this very exciting webinar. We also received other messages through social media, so I think that there is a great appreciation for your presentations and for the roundtable discussion. Just a note to introduce the next webinar that will take place next Thursday. It will be on Right to the City for Children, from value-driven discourse to transformative actions, that will be developed in cooperation with the Urban Synergies Group in Australia. And we will have speakers from UK, Australia, Rwanda, Hong Kong, and United States. So hope you will join next week. We will publish the announcement very soon. And in case you want to watch the webinar again, don't forget that it will be published on the YouTube channel of City Space Architecture on a dedicated playlist. So thanks again for joining, and see you next week. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.